For all things Halloween, this is Hauntformer, and when you think of a Halloween movie, what kind of movies come to mind? Maybe you're like most people and you just think of Halloween or any of its sequels. I mean, those are pretty safe bets. They are called Halloween movies. Not to mention Michael Myers is an iconic character of his own right. Or, if you don't care for Michael Myers, maybe you think of Halloween 3, Season of the Witch. If that's not your speed, maybe you think of Trick or Treat, which is perhaps the most Halloween-y movie there is if you count jack-o'-lanterns and orange lighting everywhere. Maybe you think of Hocus Pocus, or Beetlejuice, or Ghostbusters, or Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark if you're a new fan. To me, there are lots of different ways to define a Halloween movie, and there are lots of different types. Today, I'd like to turn your attention from the traditional types of Halloween movies to even more traditional types of Halloween movies. If you go to any retail store right now for Halloween, and you go and grab yourself some Butterfingers or Kit Kats or Reese's, chances are you might see some iconic, classic monsters on the packaging. I'm talking werewolves, vampires, and the Frankenstein monster. It's because those iconic characters, which started back in Universal Studios' horror legacy, paved the way for the horror films and characters we have today. There would be no Freddy Krueger or Jason Voorhees without Frankenstein or Dracula. We need those classic characters, and personally, when I watch those old monster movies, it gets me in the Halloween spirit. This is something I've wanted to talk about for a while on my channel, but today, to celebrate Halloween, I am going to be talking about 4 classic monster movies. That is, the 4 classic Universal horror films that crossed over the monsters. I could perhaps make an entire analysis of the Universal Studios Monsters roster. We started with The Hunchback of Notre Dame and Phantom of the Opera and winded up with Creature from the Black Lagoon and the Metaluna Mutant and the Mole People. This franchise, I don't even know what you would call it technically, this property has been around for nearly 100 years. Actually, I think The Hunchback of Notre Dame is 100 years old this year. These movies are timeless and classics in their own right, and to talk about them is really exciting to me. You know of like those modern crossover movies, like the Marvel movies, where they take these characters from their own independent films and inevitably cross them over? Well, what if I told you that that started long ago? All the way back in the 1940s with Frankenstein meets the Wolfman. This movie is technically a loose sequel to The Ghost of Frankenstein, which is the 4th Frankenstein movie after Son of Frankenstein, Bride of Frankenstein, and Frankenstein, and a sequel to the original Wolfman movie, which technically, sorta, kinda, is the original werewolf movie. There were werewolf movies before it, like Werewolf of London. But it was this movie, The Wolfman, that really got down the classic tropes of the werewolf, such as being killed with silver. As a sequel to both of those films, the 4th Frankenstein movie and the 1st Wolfman movie, we follow Larry Talbot, the Wolfman, who comes back from the dead after grave robbers robbed his grave, seeing this body get up out of the casket, and he goes to a caravan of gypsies to try to take his werewolf curse away. They eventually lead him back to Dr. Frankenstein's lab, which is well destroyed, but underneath the lab, frozen in ice, he finds the Frankenstein monster. Funny enough, the Frankenstein monster here is played by Bela Lugosi, whom originally played Dracula and who refused to play the Frankenstein monster the first time around because he didn't want his face covered in all the makeup. He since regretted that decision, giving the job instead to Boris Karloff, and they had kind of a funny feud back and forth. They would cross over in other Universal monster movies like The Black Cat, but their rivalry is kind of a funny inside joke to monster fans. It's crazy to see him as the Frankenstein monster, and while I don't think he's the best fit for it, it's a cool gimmick regardless. Seeing the climax of this movie, where the Wolfman and the Frankenstein monster face off, is really epic, and the first little glimpse into this shared universe type of thing. Interesting. The next two movies are basically one and the same. What I mean is, while they're different movies, they have very similar plot structures and similar characters. I'm talking about House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula. These two movies were actually the catalyst for this video. I've wanted to talk about them for a few years. I discovered them maybe like 2 years ago and loved them. They're not perfect movies in any right, but they are filled with that sense of spooky spirit. Now, I should note, none of these monster movies are technically Halloween movies. There are no jack-o'-lanterns or orange or purple. In fact, they're all in black and white. However, they do all share the classic monsters. And in both House of Frankenstein and House of Dracula, we get 5 monsters: a mad scientist and their hunchbacked assistant, the Wolfman, Dracula, and the Frankenstein monster. Those make up the roster of these next two movies, but as you'll see when we get to Abbott and Costello meet Frankenstein, it's only Dracula, Wolfman, and the monster that ultimately make their final debut. In both of these movies, you have a mad scientist and their hunchback trying to do some weird scientific experiments. In House of Frankenstein, it's about brain switching, and in the sequel, it's largely about curing these monsters of their ailments, which is a pretty interesting idea. When I first watched these movies, I preferred House of Frankenstein, but rewatching them this year, I think House of Dracula was a bit more captivating to me. The interesting thing about House of Frankenstein is that the Mad Doctor is played by none other than Boris Karloff himself. In a very interesting performance, he has this creepy hunchbacked assistant who just wants to find love, and the doctor promises him that if he does these sketchy things, murders perhaps, that he'll cure his hunchbackedness. Well, spoiler alert, he doesn't, because he gets infatuated with Dracula, the Wolfman, and the Frankenstein's monster. He wants to put the Frankenstein's monster brain into some crook's head, put the crook's brain into the monster's body, put Larry Talbot's mind into a different body. It's so confusing and somewhat hilarious that it makes the movie worthwhile, because the logic doesn't make any sense. Do we follow the body or follow the brain? Just shut yours off and enjoy the ride. It's a fun movie, it has its problems, but overall, it's very spooky. House of Dracula is similarly dumb, but significantly less dumb. It focuses on this main doctor guy trying to cure the monsters, specifically the Wolfman and Dracula, of their conditions. That's an interesting premise in and of itself. We kind of got that with the Wolfman in the previous movies, because Larry never wanted to be the Wolfman. But with Dracula, makes it a bit different. Although Dracula's motives are questionable here, it seems that he more so uses the doctor and his servants for his own tastes. I have to say, even though Bela Lugosi is the classic Dracula, John Carradine is a really solid Dracula, and I think He rivals Bela Lugosi for me. He has this elegance and aura that he brings to his character. It makes you relaxed to watch him, and it's almost hypnotic. He also has that really creepy stare right into the camera that really gets at you. There's an excellent scene midway through this movie where there's a woman playing the piano, and Dracula hypnotizes her to play a certain song from his village or something to the effect. And it's rather creepy. Usually these monster movies, but the monsters themselves do, get a bit schlocky, but this scene was legitimately creepy gothic horror, and I dug it. Other than that, we kind of get the same kind of rigmarole of scientists turning crazy and evil. There's an interesting thing about the main doctor having an infusion with Dracula's blood. They transfuse blood and he becomes like a vampire guy. It's a different idea, and it's well shot and well done enough. But the only thing about both of these movies, especially House of Frankenstein, that I have a problem with is that they barely show the Frankenstein monster. Especially House of Frankenstein, you're paying to see that monster, and he's only in it for like 2 minutes. What I will say, though, is Glenn Strange, who plays the Frankenstein's monster in both of these movies, and our final one I'm about to talk about, is a really great performer. I love his presence, his height, his stature. While Boris Karloff will always be the definitive Frankenstein monster, what Glenn Strange brought to the table was his imposing presence and also that signature walk, that very stiff, lanky, bulky kind of demeanor to the character, and I quite like that. Finally, I'd like to wrap out this discussion of monster crossover movies with perhaps the best of the bunch. Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein, which in some regards is a comedy, and in others is a complete horror film. It's interesting, and it's one of the earliest examples of genre crossing as well as monster crossing. Because Abbott and Costello, if you didn't know, were these classic comedians that did several great funny bits that I highly recommend you look up here on YouTube. But they also incorporate those monsters. The monsters are played seriously, and the comedy is played for laughs. And what you get is this great crossover of entertainment. The thing that a lot of the Universal monster movies miss out on is when the monsters aren't on screen, it's kind of just dull melodrama. But here, in its place, are funny comedic bits with Abbott and Costello, and it keeps the energy going. The plot is very similar to the other ones. The Wolfman's trying to cure himself and stop Dracula because Dracula wants to bring back the Frankenstein's monster for some reason. Okay. And of course, Abbott and Costello have to move these characters around, thinking they're wax figures, but they're actually the real Dracula and monster. It's all very funny stuff. Really good comedic timing in this movie especially, and the horror scenes are legitimate. It isn't until the end of this movie where we see a glimpse of another monster enter the scene, that being the Invisible Man for 5 seconds, voiced by Vincent Price, as a matter of fact. But then following this movie, we would get Abbott and Costello with the Invisible Man, with the Mummy, and so on and so forth. Eventually, the Universal monsters would get into the sci-fi atomic era, with Creature from the Black Lagoon, the Mole People, Metaluna Mutant, and then eventually, remade with the Hammer monster movies. I know this is a lot of ranting, but I have to tell ya, if you're not a fan of these classic monster movies, please consider watching them right now. Halloween is a perfect time to do it, and they're really short too. They're like an hour and 10 minutes. It's worth the investment, they're classics, and the reason that you see all of these monsters around Halloween time is because they own the holiday. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this different kind of cross-up video. And remember, for all things Halloween, this is Hauntformer.